Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Jan Beagle, Director General of the International Development Law Organization. Thank you for joining us today for this edition of IDLO's Crisis Governance Forum on the roadmap for a rule of law-based recovery. I'm very pleased that this event is co-sponsored by the Bureau of IDLO's Assembly of Parties, the governments of Pakistan, our president, and Italy and the United States of America, our vice presidents. The social, economic, and human rights crises spawned by COVID-19 have exacerbated inequalities, reversing development gains and undermining public trust and confidence in institutions. The pandemic is deepening existing fault lines in societies and generating grievances that, if not addressed, could lead to greater fragility, instability, and violence. This is particularly worrying as justice systems needed to resolve these grievances peacefully have been hard hit. Even before COVID-19, more than 1.5 billion people had a justice problem they could not resolve. For many, barriers include lack of their awareness of rights, not being able to physically access a court or pay for legal services. The pandemic threatens to widen the justice gap further, as restrictions on access coincide with a sharp rise in the need for legal protection and services, leaving many without the protection of the law. The most severe impact has been on those already living in conditions of inequality, insecurity, and injustice, who are least able to mitigate the effects of the crisis and who rely on disrupted public and social services. The impact on women and girls is particularly concerning. Curtailed access to justice institutions, rising intimate partner violence, and discriminatory laws pose significant and ongoing risks to women's lives and livelihoods. Another key challenge is corruption, which diverts funds from essential services and initiatives, undermines confidence in public institutions, and is a major impediment to sustainable development. COVID-19 has dramatically aggravated both the scale and impact of corruption, as countries mobilize and disperse significant emergency relief and recovery funding. Collectively, these developments represent a profound challenge to humanity's shared aspirations for a better future expressed in the Sustainable Development Goals. Over the past year and a half, IDLO has been working with partners in every region to provide legal and policy advice, strengthen legal and institutional capacity, and contribute to the global response to COVID-19. There are many lessons to be learned from the greatest disruption that the world has faced. The crisis has forced us to innovate, experiment, and adapt. Many good practices have emerged at local, national, regional, and international levels that can be used to help tackle inequalities, reduce fragility, and promote fairer and more resilient models of governance and development. And the rule of law is critical to this endeavor. Putting justice and the rule of law at the heart of recovery can enable policymakers to act quickly and effectively while respecting and promoting human rights. It can ensure that those in the most vulnerable situations can access essential services and the protection of the law, and empower them to contribute to the recovery as equals. And it can promote a renewed spirit of solidarity and multilateralism, safeguarding hard-won gains on peace and development, while accelerating progress on the 2030 agenda. It is in this spirit of turning challenges to opportunities that motivates IDLO's roadmap for a rule of law-based recovery. The roadmap identifies 8 concrete priority actions that can help decision makers navigate the unprecedented set of policy challenges posed by the pandemic, strengthen preparedness for future crises, tackle inequalities, and transition to a greener and more climate resilient development model. I'm delighted to have with us today a distinguished set of panelists who have agreed to share their expertise and insights on promoting a rule of law-based recovery from the pandemic. Let me introduce them. Mr. Federico Cafiero Durajo, National Anti-Mafia and Counter-Terrorism Public Prosecutor of Italy. Ms. Lynn Rose Jenner, Executive Council of Young Women Plus Leaders for Peace in the Philippines. Mr. Gerald Abila, attorney and founder of Barefoot Law in Uganda. The Honorable Rose Ibrahim, High Court Judge from Tanzania. Dr. Martin Grammathoff, Director, Measuring Justice at the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law in the Netherlands. Before turning to our panelists, I am pleased to invite His Excellency Johar Salim, Ambassador of Pakistan to Italy and President of IDLO's Assembly of Parties, to provide opening remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Excellency John Beagle, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is a singular privilege for me to be part of this excellent initiative to discuss key questions at the heart of a rule of law-based recovery from COVID-19. We are living in extraordinary times, witnessing a transformative event. While we face a most formidable challenge, not just in terms of a public health emergency, but a political, social, and economic crisis of historic proportions, we also have a great opportunity to build back better by effecting an equitable and sustainable recovery, founded on the pillars of peaceful societies with access to justice across the board and effective, accountable institutions. These pillars of SDG 16 are not just inherently important, but also they are vital for other SDGs, such as SDG 3, SDG 5, SDG 8, SDG 10, and even SDG 13, climate change, that is. The diverse and distinguished panel assembled by IDLO will provide for an insightful debate and dialogue on the subject, and hopefully provide some answers to some of the key questions as to how to promote an equitable recovery. And ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind. How rule of law-based approaches can help tackle inequality, injustice, and insecurity, and enhance confidence in public institutions. Learning from this pandemic, we can build more effective judicial systems, and we can invest in effective and accountable institutions to tackle inequality, conflict, and climate change. While the devastation caused by the pandemic is evident with millions of deaths and trillions in accumulated economic losses, we have also witnessed some surprising trends. Many segments of big business, particularly big tech companies, have prospered, in some cases making extraordinary gains. Return on asset has also increased in many cases. On the whole, while hundreds of millions have been pushed into poverty, even extreme poverty, the figure for that is 150 million, the rich have become richer in many societies, thus leading to an increase in inequality. Similarly, gender disparity has also exacerbated, exposing women and girls to increased violence and marginalization. As I've said before, there's a huge opportunity before us to regroup and pursue the Sustainable Development Goals with renewed vigor. But that would only be meaningful if it inspires a rule-based recovery, enabling inclusive development. Rule of law and access to justice can also help counter the grave menaces of corruption, inequity, and lack of accountability, as so eloquently put forth by Excellency John Beagle. It is extremely important that we address the issue of illicit transfer of wealth from developing to developed countries or safe havens, which is at the heart of many of those impeding socioeconomic progress and development for peoples around the world. I look forward to witnessing a most well-informed and thought-provoking debate with ideas emerging that would have a global relevance and resonance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Salim, for those insightful remarks and for your leadership at IDLO. I will now ask our panelists to make their remarks, and following that, I will open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and our secretary will be monitoring that function. And then after those questions, I'll ask our panelists to provide some concluding reflections. So let's begin. Our first panelist is Mr. Cafiero Di Rajo. As the Italian National Anti-Mafia and Counterterrorism Public Prosecutor, he has played instrumental roles in combating mafia and other organized crime. Mr. Cafiero Di Rajo, could you provide some insight into the new threats that have emerged from organized criminal groups as a consequence of COVID-19? And what measures do you think are needed to tackle corruption and organized crime as we recover from the crisis?
Si ascolta?
Can you hear me? Good morning. I'd like to extend my welcome to the organizers, to the General Director of IDLO, Mrs. Jan Beagle, and to all participants. Thank you very much for inviting me. The pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, just like it was the case as a consequence of big natural disasters or situations of great crisis, is also offering new illegal business opportunities to organized crime. So in my capacity of national anti-mafia prosecutor, it is clear that we are deeply committed right now. In fact, mafia organizations are trying to enter economy, and they work transnationally. They are not just working in a single country. They use financial channels, allowing them to hide the transfer of funds from one country to another. They work through capital companies, and they incorporate these corporations not in Italy, but in different countries in the world. In fact, the money they have make it possible for them to operate as global business entities. In fact, they look for those countries in which the response to crime is weaker, because there is no, or at least it is just, we just have a very limited rule that enables us to fight mafia, modern mafias, in an effective way. By modern mafias, I mean those organizations that can use consultants, that can use professionals from different areas to transfer their assets, their wealth, their money. And in a moment like this, they identify those countries in which it is easier to work, to buy economic activities, to acquire economic activities which experienced big difficulties. For instance, in some countries, and this is true in Europe, but this is true also elsewhere, the companies that developed hotel activities or restaurants, or companies which made money because of tourists, were forced to stop. And that stop made their survival very difficult. And it is in these very sectors that mafias are really working. In fact, with their cash, with their money, they were able to acquire these businesses. And they acquired these businesses through systems which are often real financial three-side movements. That is, they use other economic entities that are present in different countries. This is and in this way, it is more difficult for us to respond. So this modus operandi and the abilities of mafias to move globally is today accompanied by the use of virtual currency, bitcoins, or other thousands of forms of money transfer through intangible channels, invisible channels, and this results in the need for a great cooperation between countries. It is no longer the banking channel any longer, but these are channels that from time to time need collaboration and cooperation between different law enforcement agencies. And this is especially true in those countries in which there is a greater coverage of these people. It's more difficult to find them because the rules do not allow us to fight and to monitor these illegal financial flows. Another point, the form of communication that these people use. They often use scripted devices, scripted instruments, media. So it's impossible for us to know what they talk about. And this is an additional element resulting in a need for greater law enforcement cooperation and judicial cooperation at a global level, with the participation of all those who can be concerned, because they hide themselves, the fact that communication is hidden makes it very difficult for us to monitor how these people manage illegal assets and wealth. And this deeply affects our democracy and our economy. I think that it is therefore indispensable that all countries move along the same lines. If Pakistan, Uganda, Tanzania, for instance, if in these countries companies are set up or incorporated with the mafia money, it is very important for us to fight those mafias, because these countries, Pakistan, Italy, Tanzania, Uganda, all other countries can work together. For instance, providing the warning signals because they have an idea that some mafia people are working there. But in order to do that, it is important to track foreign investment coming from abroad. If we don't pay attention to this, we don't realize that something is occurring around us. Italy had to do that little by little, fighting the different mafias that were born in Italy. And we realized that these mafias today work globally. So to fight these mafia organizations, we have to work all together. So I think that the main lesson we can draw to fight mafias at a global level is that altogether civil societies, organizations, sectoral organizations, all people working in the culture world, in the broad sense, of course, together with judges and law enforcement agencies and policymakers that intend to select and understand when there are third parties that to some extent support mafia people. They all have to work together, because we can rescue our democracy with the work of all of us. Thank you very much, Director General. And for the time being, I would leave it at that. But then, of course, I'm ready to go back to some points if there are questions or you want to ask me to say something. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cafiero de Rajo. I'll now turn to our second speaker, Ms. Lynn Rose Genon of the Executive Council of Young Women Plus for Peace and Leadership in the Philippines. And Lynn Rose is also a member of the 16 by 16 initiative of youth-led organizations supporting SDG 16. So, Ms. Genon, your organization has been working to build a network of young people in the conflict-affected Mindanao region to help create a culture of peace. And we've seen in recent years the strength of the collective voice of young people globally, speaking up for intergenerational issues from climate change to inequality and exclusion. So what actions do you think are needed for the meaningful participation of youth, particularly young women and girls, in conflict prevention, resolution, and peace building?
Thank you so much, Director General, and greetings everyone. And it's my pleasure to represent a network of young women leaders and allies for peace in the Philippines in this conversation today. And reiterating what the Director General mentioned, my intervention today will be centered on the meaningful inclusion of young people, including young women in peace building and sustaining peace. So firstly, I would like to highlight that young people of diverse backgrounds are actively working and committed to continue to work for more peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And I think there is a need to recognize young people's critical role as agents of change for sustainable development and peace, to address the growing mistrust between young people and governance institutions, especially with how COVID exacerbates the already compounding challenges faced by the youth. And when I say that young people are already actively working in local communities, to give you some examples from our network, in the past year since the COVID pandemic, our network has implemented a couple of activities and programs, and we've spearheaded like emergency response projects that benefited individuals in different communities, especially in communities in Mindanao in the Philippines. And our interventions include psychosocial activities, distribution of hygiene and safety kits, educational kits, and healing packages in communities. And these are led by young people. And these interventions were coupled with an awareness campaign on COVID-19 prevention. And we also hosted community youth peace building dialogues. And those discussions include updates on the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region peace transition, the 2022 upcoming national elections in our country, and the impacts of COVID-19 to young peace builders, and human rights in times of pandemic, and also about proactive youth leaderships. And these are maybe general description of initiatives led by young people. And in our work with young peace builders, we have seen also, especially more clearly during the pandemic, that how access to education is fundamental for facilitating young people's positive engagement in peace. And in the context of COVID, one of the barriers of inclusion is the digital divide, and that includes lack of access to gadgets, internet, and even stable signals. And the problem of digital divide, I think, must be addressed squarely. In the Philippines, for instance, despite the high internet penetration, many people in rural areas and in poor households, and this includes conflict-affected and post-conflict areas, do not have access to computers, internet, and also lack computer literacy. Therefore, efforts to improve service delivery through online platforms are promising. But I think I would like to emphasize that this entails a rather holistic approach of ICT infrastructure development, clear and implementable policy for integration, and improvement for basic computer literacy of young people, especially the marginalized sectors, and that includes young women. If this is not addressed, we are increasing the already compounding vulnerabilities of youth. For instance, in the Philippines during the lockdown, there's an increased number of violence and exploitation of young women and girls, with subsequent increase of teenage pregnancies, early marriages, and sexual exploitation. To show, to highlight one case, for instance, one of our network members, Rika May from Maguindanao, Philippines, her group spearheaded a project to educate young women between ages of 15 and 30 about reproductive health by handing out reading materials, and to address the increasing number of teenage pregnancy in their area. And also we were able, through their network, we were able to communities in conflict and post-conflict zones to have access to information about COVID-19 that are translated to local languages. And I think Rika May's experience highlight the need to invest in local actors, strengthen local capacities, and strengthen local young peace builders. Also, the digital divide and increased stakeholder engagement through online platforms like what we are using at the moment, for SDG implementation, monitoring, and review can limit youth participation if it remains unaddressed. Not all young people has the technical tools and skills to be here, and not all young people live in areas with ICT infrastructure. Some areas would even have mobile signals. So, cognizant of these barriers and acknowledging the agency and the compounding challenges faced by youth in both local and global level, I think there's an urgent need to scale up youth-led peace-building works in the local communities. And I think we can do this if we first provide access to a safe platform for youth, young women and allies to speak up, volunteer, and contribute. Second is to provide accessible, relevant funding, deliberate support, and accessible information for young peace builders. In our experience, youth-led initiatives facilitate the inclusion of the most marginalized and vulnerable young people, such as the young women living in transitory sites who carry the burden of care work during the time of pandemic. It is also important to note that these youth-led networks are essential for sustaining peace. These youth organizations and movements that are leading efforts for sustainable development in local communities often lack accessible funding and resources because these organizations tend to be informal and without legal registration. So when we talk about actions needed for the meaningful participation of youth, we need to be committed to investing in meaningful participation of youth as leaders and peace builders, and allocating resources to initiatives in peace building, prevention of violent extremism, and sustaining peace that are led by youth, including young women. And also to foster a recognition of young people's critical role as agents of change for sustainable development and peace, and to provide an enabling environment for youth action towards building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, including like promotion and protection of civic space and greater protection of young peace builders and activists. In the face of crisis, in our case, for instance, in our work, we have seen that democracies are under attack. In my home country, for instance, young people organizing and addressing the lack of response and inefficiency of the government are being harassed both online and offline by state forces. We have seen the importance in that experience. We have seen the importance of strong local civil society, youth-led networks that can hold governments accountable. And we need to put more young people in leadership roles, and we need to support and create an enabling environment for more young people to take on these roles. And I think it is crucial that governments make sustained commitments to rebuild young people's trust and confidence in governments. And also, the leadership of young people needs to be recognized, invested in, and amplified. I think the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the importance of strong leadership and effective state power coordination, evidence-based decision-making, transparency, and whole of government approach, and emphasizing on leaving no one behind. I think we need to step up on our global efforts in promoting a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future. Through the work of our network, we aim to remind each and every one of us that women, young women, and allies' meaningful participation are important in sustaining peace and security, not just in our country, but around the world. Thank you so much for this space, and I give it back to the Director General.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jenon. Our next speaker, Mr. Gerald Abila, has been named an American Bar Association legal rebel and is a pioneer of the legal innovation movement in Africa. He's the founder of Barefoot Law, which through the innovative use of digital technology empowers people to develop legal solutions for their justice needs. Mr. Abila, how can technology and digital innovation promote greater access and help close the justice gap? And what can we do to avoid a new digital divide, as Lynn Rose was just speaking about? Over to you.
Thank you. I'm experiencing some connectivity challenges. I don't know if you.
Yeah, we can hear you. Hmm.
Sorry, I'm experiencing some connectivity challenges. Can I come in after the next panelist?
Yes, fine. We'll just wait there. Thank you, Gerald. We'll move on to our next speaker, the Honorable Rose Ibrahim, who is a High Court judge from Tanzania. And Judge Ibrahim has significant experience on environmental and natural resource matters, having worked as an advocate and in-house counsel in the mining sector prior to be appointed to the High Court in 2014. But Judge Ibrahim, what are the key barriers to people accessing justice to be able to uphold and enforce their environmental rights? And how can the law and the judiciary in particular help to protect the environment and promote climate justice?
Thank you very much, Director General. I believe you can all hear me. When I talk of the environment, I always like to start with this saying that I saw when I visited one of our national parks at Ngorongoro, and in one hotel I found this saying that really inspires me, and it says, imagine if tree gave free Wi-Fi. We would all be planting like crazy. It's a pity they only give us the oxygen we breathe. And I'm saying that on the context of the environmental issue on its own right. To begin with, I would like to give a small introduction of the term environmental protection. It means that it's a natural resources and the existing natural resources protection. And all in all, where possible, it's about damage. It's about repair to where there's damage and reverse the trends that maybe we had poor trains or inhabitable trains or that sort of things. And the climate, when we talk about climate justice, it focuses on local impact and experience and inequitable vulnerability, the importance of community voices and demands of the community sovereignties and functioning. So all in all, climate justice advocates it came as a result of the climate change, which now means that there's an urgent global health and environmental health challenge that require the engagement of the government, of the nationals, international, including the judiciary, of course, to mitigate the situation. So on the question, when we talk about the barrier to people accessing justice to uphold and enforce their environmental rights, of course, there are many issues that I'll talk about in particular in Tanzania. And when I talk about those issues, of course, after listing them, I will talk on these issues vis-a-vis the COVID-19 pandemic on its access. And one of the main issues that we face in Tanzania is lack of awareness among the public on environmental law. And I'm saying that because in Tanzania, first, we do not have an environmental court. We simply have a land court. And most cases in Tanzania, or that comes to court for court to litigate on environment, are mostly on the issue of on the nuisance, on the tort, damages, on the strict liabilities, that kind of thing. So most Tanzanians have not cultivated the culture of pursuing their rights to a clean and healthy environment in courts of law. And another thing that you can say is institutionalization of legal training in environmental law. In Tanzania, it's not fully developed in legal, the legal training on environment, on the legal institutions. And in this, I would give an example, like we do not have in the universities like a subject like environment law. Most laws that you deal at the university, you would also you'd like do, maybe if you're doing mining law. So there are those criteria that have been put by, we have this national environmental policy that you have to adhere to. That's where to mostly go. But the really subject, or the really awareness on the environment on its own right, I would say it's lacking in Tanzania. Therefore, you find that most legal practitioners, even in the bar, and even members of the bench, are not fully conversant with the subject. That much I would say. The only subject that we have a number of cases that they only come at the end of the day, like I said, they are deciding that maybe it's a nuisance or liabilities. Someone has invaded me, or someone has, there is this fall water coming. But it's not like environment as environment. They don't mean that jurisprudence hasn't been much on environment as on its own right. I'm repeating the word again. And then that's what I said earlier. It comes to it comes to the restriction of the civil suits on the analysis of the phrase environment. As I've just said, the judiciary have mostly been confined to a relatively restricted definition, like that penal code, the criminal law. That's how it has just confined itself to that. It has been construed, the issue of environment has been construed in relation to citizens' right to health, clean and uncontaminated surroundings only. The analysis, mostly in case laws here, does not cover the protection of sectoral natural resources such as wildlife, fisheries, forests. Like I've said, since most cases are normally in criminal nature, the few civil cases that relate to sectoral natural resources legislation that exist have a bias of enforcement of administrative tasks, such as issuance of licenses and permits, and that's you find it in the, maybe people are arrested at the natural resources. People are arrested at national parks, and mostly it will be like, you don't have a license to be here, or you have been arrested with weapons without license. So it's mostly restricted into that nature. And again, there is a difficulty in locating various pieces of legislation, environmental laws. That's another barrier. It's very few people, and mostly, like I'll say, maybe people who have lawyers who have worked in mining, or maybe lawyers who have worked in water resources, that would mostly come with those laws. And most laws are sectoral, like there's mining laws only, that's where they will talk about environment, or those water resources, and they will talk about the protection of those laws, but having the law specific, speaking of environment, it's not there. So it becomes even difficult for other lawyers who are not engaged on those sectoral laws to know those other law over environmental laws. And it's the same, I'm repeating again, it comes to the even judges. So when the person comes to court with those sectoral laws, that's when even the judges get, you know, that they get the grasp. But by then it will be on just that aspect, on that sectoral issue that it's being talking about. Which brings the lack of framework environmental law, which would provide some guidance and direction on various issues. And this has complicated the matter to some extent. Again, there's complication of litigations in court. And I would say the constitution of Tanzania is not directly providing for environmental rights on its own right. I'm speaking it again on the issue that for one to achieve on environmental right, it has to be connected with other rights, like such as right to life, right to health, right to economic gain, those kind of rights, and all these need direct suffering of an individual mostly. And then it goes to court fees. People fear access to justice if they're required to pay for court fees, incurs cost of litigation, and said environmental rights, which can be enforced by way of civil suits. People have to pay for it, and it is not modest for an individual to pay for litigation which himself is not solely affected. Considering that environment as it is not always an individual case. It involves a community or a future generation. So having looked at all those impediments and coming to how the law and judiciary help to promote the environment and promote climate justice, the main thing should be by implementing environmental laws. There should be one big environmental law that all other sectoral law have to go and make reference to it. And there has to be by interpreting the laws in regard to protection of environment and climate justice, by passing cases with the environmental jurisprudence that most of the cases that in Tanzania have been passed, like I've said, they all go like nuisance, fall water, and that kind of things. But rather, we should go more and on awareness, go further and discuss the environment as environment, not just on nuisance issue. The court should go further and issue writs such as permanent injunction for where a certain maybe company or a certain group or a certain person is polluting the environment, not only because that there are people there, but it should be that that the environment have to be preserved, and this kind of act should not proceed. And judiciary should also pass judgments by forcing public bodies to take actions on banning environmental issues. I think it should be a rather proactive, and this activism on insofar as when it comes to environmental issues are concerned. It should go more and further on that. Even someone has just come on the criminality of it, but I believe we judiciary could use the forum or could use the opportunity to explore further and to expand the jurisprudence further.
Excuse me, Judge, just in terms of the time that we have, would you be able to close now so that we could have all the speakers, and I give you the floor again?
Sure, yes. Just to close and speaking on the issue of COVID-19, I would say that the access to justice has been limited. Only those few who can have access now of what we are doing. There are no more people having access to justice, bringing in not only if you can imagine the other issues is complicated, leave alone the issue of our environment. So having said that, thank you very much, and I urge every person, and I urge the whole world to work together to preserve the environment as we borrowed it from the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judge. I'm going to go back now to Mr. Gerald Abila. I think he is with us now. Yes, and the question was, how can technology and digital innovation promote greater access and help close the justice gap? And what can we do to avoid a new digital divide? Over to you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I had a reality check earlier on when I experienced connectivity issues. I'm currently speaking to you with 2 mobile hotspots and 1 Wi-Fi, just in case. But again, it's a reminder of the connectivity challenges in this side of the world. Some of the challenges we need to deal with, and that will form part of my presentation. Thank you, Director General, for the invitation. I would like to thank IDLO, the governments of Pakistan, Italy, and the United States for sponsoring this discussion, and greetings to everyone. My name is Gerald Abila. I'm an attorney and founder of Barefoot Law, which uses digital technologies to help people to come up with solutions to the legal problems that they face. And of course, this is guided by our mission, which is to get the law to protect vulnerable people across Africa. And we believe at Barefoot Law that by making the law readily available and accessible, then people will use it to prevent and resolve more legal problems that they face, eventually leading to less conflict in society. And I believe access, the keyword access, is important because the anatomy of an injustice starts from the knowledge of rights. Therefore, the more people know their rights, the more there is a chance that something can be done about it in case of a violation. But in order to make this happen, people should have access. Again, access. And that is access to knowledge and access to pathways of justice. And this is where technology again comes in form of mobile phones and in terms of the internet. In fact, technology is now so ubiquitous. I was reading a study just before I came here that showed that there are more mobile phones than working toilets. The research was done that showed about 7.7 billion people in the world have, of the 7.7 billion people in the world, 6 billion have access to a mobile phone, compared to about 4.5 billion that have access to a working toilet. And Director General, to see a young girl regain confidence in her right to inherit property because of a simple explanation she received on an SMS, or how to go about such a process for her, to help a young mother gain spousal support by following simple guides through chatting with a group of lawyers located remotely. To me, that is what technology is about. And eventually, that is what a combination of technology and the law can do. And with this approach, the difference in the lives of people at so many stages is fulfilling to see. And again, that is where technology and digital innovations plays a very unique role, because of all methods in existence, none have demonstrated the impact or potential impact technology can have. In order for us to understand how digital technology and innovations promote greater access, we need to look at access to justice from the demand and from the supply side. From the demand side, it should be about letting the public know that they can and should be protected by the law, whether by knowing their rights or how to protect them, they can get justice. At the same time, about learning what to do in case of a violation of such a right, and eventually giving them access to seek resolutions with the help or without the help of a trained legal professional. But in so doing, from the supply side at least, we should make these services consumable. And I guess that's a challenge for us all. How do you teach a small community how to ask a question using a technology device when they feel violated? From the supply side, and a lot of previous speakers have mentioned this, technology and digital innovation brings together various stakeholders in the justice sector, formal, informal, government, and non-government, toward making access to justice a reality. For instance, with one technology platform, it's possible to follow a case from when the crime is committed all the way to delivery of the judgment, both from the informal and from the formal justice sector. This also helps in combating corruption, as has been stressed. But again, the challenge here is, how do you create a mindset shift in the legal professionals that are going to use some of these systems from a supply side? Again, also from a demand side. Otherwise, you'll end up spending so much money to develop a system that will not be in use. All these benefits, again, are limited in effect if we do not overcome the digital divide. And to stress this point, I would like to draw a lesson from the pandemic. As the pandemic spread across the world, wealthier nations with the necessary resources had a chance to develop vaccines and distributed these first to their populations, while the rest of the world was on hold. And poorer nations were left, in many cases, reduced to begging for access to these vaccines. Eventually, some nations agreed to share vaccines, but then it turned out that many of the poorer nations did not have the necessary infrastructure in place to store or to distribute the vaccine. In terms of equitable access to new technologies, from an international perspective, a lot has to be done to ensure that these new and emerging technologies are accessible to all, even those in poorer countries. The previous panelist, Ms. Janos, eloquently spoke about this from the perspective of equitable access of technology and gadgets for youth. But at the same time, while we're advocating for equitable access of these technologies, poorer nations must build the necessary capacity for the creative application of these technologies towards tackling pressing development challenges, including SDG 16. And in order to do that, as I conclude, we need to employ design thinking. We need to be intentional in how we innovate and invent. And this should be geared first and foremost towards inclusion. This will mean that from the concept stage, we should have clear users in mind and be responsive to their feedback and to research and to the demonstrated changes that we need to implement in order for these technologies to work. Ultimately, there's a responsibility on governments, or there is a call for the leadership in the sector to be vision-bearing and to fully contextualize the problem and think outside the box for possible solutions. I look forward to learning in these deliberations, and I thank you all for listening. I'm glad my connection stabilized. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad that it even happens to you, because when it happens to the rest of us who are, not so knowledgeable as you, we feel so bad. So it's nice to see not only it happens to you, but of course that you are able to fix it very quickly. Our final speaker is Dr. Martin Gramatikov from HIL, the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law. And HIL's mission is to empower people to prevent or resolve their most pressing justice problems by 2030. So Dr. Gramatikov, HIL argues that to solve people's justice challenges, we must first understand the issues that they face. What is your assessment of the current data challenges in the justice sector? And how can we use data to promote a more people-centered approach to justice?
Thank you very much, Jan, and dear fellow panelists. I am thrilled to be here, and I echo what Judge Ibrahim ended up with, the importance of climate justice. It's so hot here in Sofia, Bulgaria, that some gadget outside melted. So just like Gerard, I'm also on my cell phone. Also echo what Gerald said about the need to look for the demand side of justice. And at the very heart of what HIL is doing and what our aspirations are is the so-called people-centered justice, which I believe is also dear to IDLO. It is at the very heart of the SDGs, of the pathfinders, and many others. For me, the definition of people-centered justice is justice that works for the people. No matter what institutions we have, no matter what laws we have, if they don't solve people's problems, then it's not people-centered justice. It's not working. So in that respect, people-centered justice is the way forward. It is where we should all be looking for and should be moving towards. But there is one huge impediment to people-centered justice, and it is the lack of data, the lack of mechanisms to know whether there is justice or there is no justice. And I don't need to convince you a lot how shocking it is that in 21st century, when we can open a website and see how many cases of COVID there are all over the world on a daily basis, or we can watch live pictures from Mars. But just pick up a random country in the world and try to figure out what are the problems of people, how many of these problems are resolved, are the problems, the justice problems resolved fairly, and you know very well that you will have big troubles. And then this is 21st century. So justice is lagging behind all other public policy areas. And in essence, this means that justice doesn't have a priority. Justice is way behind everything else. So that's why it's so important when we're talking about people-centered justice, also to think, is there a fuel there in this car? Is there data to tell us whether we are moving forward? I personally believe if there is no serious attention to data and to evidence, that people-centered justice will remain the remain a bandwagon. In a couple of years, we just will not remember it, and we'll be thinking about the next slogan. So that's why just data is so important. And I'll give you one example. I think COVID-19 just exacerbated and pinpointed how important data is and how little there is in the field of justice. Last year, we did ask a lot of experts around the world what they think in the middle of the pandemic will be the impact of COVID on people's justice needs. Experts, because we didn't have a lot of data back then, told us that they anticipate a rise of employment disputes, rise of domestic violence, increase of debt and money, also problems, legal problems for SMEs. So this was incredibly rich insight, but based on expert opinion. Right now, last week, actually, together with Gerald and the wonderful colleagues from Barefoot Law, the innovation, the startup that he's leading, we managed to gather data from Uganda, where we asked people, what are your legal problems at the moment, and how they are connected to COVID. And we found a very interesting picture. What the experts told is more or less true, but with a lot of nuances. People from big urban centers, younger people, report a lot of problems which they attribute to COVID. Problems like employment, problems like housing, debt, etc., etc. If you look at the more, excuse me, if you look at the more rural population, the older, less educated population, you will see the classical problems like land, oh, excuse me, land, crime, etc., just continuing. Also, the problems that young people, and I took a lot of note from what Lynn Rose said, they are much less resolved. So problems that were caused by COVID, of course, they're newer problems. They're fresh in a way, they're in the pipeline, but they are apparently also more difficult to resolve. I will not go into a lot of details. The results of this study will be very soon available on our website, heal.org, so you can check it out, and I can share the report that I referred to in the chat here. But what this little example is showing is how important it is to have data, and how data can help us to devise policies, to design, as Gerald said, services and solutions according to what people need and not what establishments or elites or institutions need. So I am going to repeat myself probably for a fifth time that what is needed is a paradigm shift toward people-centered justice. What we should be talking about is where people in Uganda, in Tanzania, in the States, all over the world are able to resolve their problems in fair way. And for that, we need many other things, but also data and evidence. Thank you very much for the opportunity to say that. And now back over to you, Jan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gramatikov. And thanks also to our audience who have submitted to us some questions in the chat. I'm now going to call on two of our audience members to ask questions to the panel. The first speaker is Mr. Yaroslav Grigierchuk. He is the Deputy Business Ombudsman from Ukraine. You have the floor.
Yes, colleagues, are you with me?
Yes, we hear you.
Which means that I'm with you as well. Indeed, Ms. Director General, thank you very much for providing me such a kind opportunity to speak up. Indeed, I represent the Ukraine's Business Ombudsman Council, which is an innovative alternative dispute resolution mechanism jointly set up by the government of Ukraine, EBRD, OECD, and 5 large local business associations in order to enable Ukrainian businesses to lodge complaints with us in an attempt to challenge and resolve instances of business malpractices on the part of public authorities in a pre-trial manner. Therefore, the mandate of what we are doing resonates quite well, I must admit, with a few themes that characterize the subject matter of this event. In particular, the access to justice, the institutional creativity, the idea of inclusiveness, which is illustrated so well with the fact that our institution in Ukraine has this multi-stakeholder nature. And indeed, the Ukrainian experience proves that if you structure reputational leverage well, even though you cannot be vested with binding authority, you might bring wonderful results. Since we got launched in May 2015, we accepted we received more than 9,000 complaints into consideration. We issued more than 3,000 individual recommendations, and the percentage of our individual recommendations being accepted by the local authorities in Ukraine exceeds 90%, which is an absolutely wonderful result. Against this background, although I might continue on and on to speak about the institution that I work for, but nonetheless, as the time is short, against this background, I would like to ask the question to any of the panelists who would be willing to comment. To which extent you think that institutional innovation, as illustrated among other things by this example that I am giving from Ukraine, might indeed constitute as one of the priorities in an attempt to tackle corruption? And on top of that, would you agree with me that when it comes to steps aimed at strengthening anti-corruption institutions, the focus might also be made not vis-a-vis the traditional mechanism that we know all over, which is the traditional anti-corruption prosecutor's office, law enforcement investigatory body, traditional National Anti-Corruption Prevention Agency, but also to the agencies like Ukraine's Business Ombudsman Council, where this anti-corruption implication from our activity comes from the fact that indeed some of those instances of business malpractice on the part of public authorities might be triggered by a certain corrective approaches at the part of our complainants, let's say competitors acting in the illicit way. So the question is again about the relevance of Ukraine's experience when it comes to institutional innovation in creating a mechanism to enable access to the justice by employing a multi-stakeholder approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor now to Ms. Shivani Malhotra. She's a senior justice advisor in the United States State Department. You have the floor. You're muted.
Yeah, I unmuted myself. Thank you so much. This has been a great panel and something that's very timely for the bureau that I work for, which is the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement for the State Department. We are the lead on criminal justice reform, and as part of our kind of realignment efforts over the past 2 years, we have been focusing a lot on design and innovation, and specifically on using data to make things, to measure justice and to ensure that our programs are more agile and more reflective of the work that we're doing in these countries. So it's been great to hear the panel talk about the kind of various issues. My question relates a little bit to the flip side of what the panelists have been discussing this morning. We've heard a lot about the importance of the role of civil society. We've heard a lot about the challenges that we're facing with regard to corruption, with regard to gender inequalities. I would like to hear a little bit from the panels of what they feel is important for the governments, and multilateral institutions to prioritize. There are so many challenges that governments are facing now looking into the post-COVID world. So it would be great to hear what they feel when it comes to accessing justice and building justice globally, what governments should prioritize moving forward. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting questions. I'm going to give the floor back now to the panelists to give their reflections on those questions or on any of the other points that have been made by their fellow panelists. Just in the interest of time, I'd ask you to keep to around 3 minutes each. I am going to begin with Mr. Katsuhiro Durajo. You have the floor, sir. I think you are muted. You're still muted. Perhaps while he's looking for the unmute, let us move on to Lynn-Rose Genon. And I will come back to you, Mr. Durajo, in a moment. Lynn-Rose.
Thank you for the floor. And maybe before I share my reflections, maybe to the two questions, like a quick rejoinder and maybe also reflection of what Mr. Gerald actually shared earlier about access. And I agree that, like I also tackle about a little bit about access in my intervention earlier. And I think access is a prerequisite for inclusion. And in the context of ICTs, for instance, or technologies, inclusion requires availability and accessibility of technological infrastructure and devices, and making it available and free, especially in vulnerable areas. And I think also that connects to access to justice, as what is elaborated in the panel as well. And what I want also to highlight is that, when it talk about access and safe access to the internet or ICT infrastructure, it is also gendered. And also to highlight that, for instance, both women and girls are being put in place of danger in trying to find internet connection in the context of the Philippines. For instance, students and teachers venture at the top of the hill, like literally, and women and girls, they go to poorly lit places, which heightens the danger of sexual violence, especially for young girls. And there have been cases in the Philippines about that. So one thing that I would like to emphasize when we talk about access, yes, it is a prerequisite for inclusion, and also to emphasize that safe accessibility to ICT infrastructure is gendered. And at the same time, when you look at access as well, that intersectionality of culture and gender must not be ignored as well, because like provision of ICT infrastructure is good, but we also need to look into putting safeguards, and safeguard must be linked and nuanced by deep cultural understanding, because in deeply conservative communities, for example, it varies between gender, and also age is another factor to look into that. So, and also a quick reflection on the question about innovation, and I think investing in youth when it comes to innovation is also, I think, one of the things that I want to highlight. And I think it is we need to partner and support economic empowerment initiatives led by young people, and most of these are support youth innovation. And I think the need to build partnership, not just within government agencies, but also private partnerships to support and scale up innovation led by youth is also important. And I think it was mentioned, I'm not sure I get really the question, but I mentioned on corruption, just to cite one example. Like during COVID-19, there was young people led an online budget tracker in the Philippines to track where the resources of the country is going at the time of the pandemic. And I think that was really instrumental in the check and balance process. And those are initiated by youth. And as to where the government should focus, and the second question, I think invest where the work is. And I think invest in the local actors. And I think when I say invest in the local actors, I mean emphasize on young actors by providing more accessible funding and resources, like what I mentioned. Create mechanisms to work with youth organizations and network as meaningful partners, and recognize that youth also is a diverse group, and youth have diverse vulnerabilities. And COVID-19 has exposed new emerging vulnerabilities with young people. And I think data is very, very important as well in looking into that. So I think those are just my reflections on the questions and the panelists. I'll give it back to the Director General. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn Rose. I give you now the floor, Mr. Caffiero Durajo.
Si sente?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Thank you very much, Director General. I think I can comment on a couple of points. The first point, what can agencies or associations do? Of course, on the one side, governmental agencies support the regulatory framework that from time to time is created in order to support the recovery of economy. And from this perspective, special support should be given to young people. Special support should be given to partnerships with young people so that young people can be part of the economic setting. So it's important for them to be able to set up new businesses. For instance, in Italy, we have innovative startups that are promoted in the sense that young people can set up a company, an undertaking, even just using the internet. That is, they just give their name to the government, just doing everything on the net. So it has become easier to set up an economy, and also they are given public funds. So this is a way to help young people be part of the economic fabric. So these people take on their own responsibility, and it's important for us to help them. This is a very important challenge, especially in a period of COVID, in a period in which businesses were put to a halt. That's why it is important to give young people the opportunity to enter the market. This is fundamental. Not only that, I think that an important role can also be played by associations. And I'm talking of industrialist associations, for instance, the associations of farmers, that is, of all those categories that work, that are part of the economy, and as such, they can report distortions on the market, but at the same time, they can do something to prevent violations of the rules, and at the same time, they may report if there is some clue that something is wrong on the market. We talked of organized crime before, we talked of corruption. These are almost two sides of the same coin, because these people break the rules. So I think that the first element that can improve our society and our economy is, in fact, the dynamic work of sectoral associations and organizations. That is, those organizations that work in individual industries, individual sectors, and they represent cohesive force, and they can work together so that they can not only work for inclusivity, but at the same time, then can demonstrate which is the best way, the best course of action for the best economic progress. Also, civil society. Civil society has a fundamental role to play. I think that the participation of an active civil society that can pinpoint the way of the rule of law, of following the rules, respecting the rules, but also respecting human dignity, the dignity of individuals. And this is fundamental in the labor market. It is important to promote a company that, on the one side, improves our economy, but at the same time gives dignity to workers. So a company that is almost a social company, a social enterprise. And I think that from this perspective, in Italy, we have made much progress through the use of the assets seized from the mafia organizations, because we seized assets from mafia organizations and now they are used for businesses. So companies that are taken away from mafia organizations and then they are given to associations of young volunteers so they can work. But also they also can do some social work. And I would stop here. Thank you very much, Director General.
Thank you very much. And I'm giving the floor now to Mr. Abila.
Thank you, Director General. I have a few reactions and then I'll go to my reflections. To what Martin said, data is so important that it plays a role in giving us insights in some of the challenges people are facing so we can design creative solutions. But it's also important from a tech perspective, because using that same data, we can build artificial intelligence systems. Of course, making sure that a lot of the things that we attempt to overcome are not some of the problems or some of the issues we end up creating, including inclusivity. to what General said, thank you for bringing that up. Creating access to nothing is not really creating access to justice. So no matter how many tech tools we deploy, no matter how creative we are, if at the end of the day, there is no general observance of the rule of law, or there is no justice to flow through that pipeline, then the systems we've created are really useless. To the question that Shabi Bani mentioned on government and international partners, I feel government should act as a facilitator for creative processes in the countries in which they lead, while international partners should try and find creative ways to fund initiatives that provide access to justice at the grassroots. And now, to my reflections, it's the last time I checked, it's 2021, and we have 2 billionaires going to space, and the big argument between them is whether space starts at 80 kilometers or 100 kilometers, and if indeed going up 80 kilometers is truly going to space. Again, in 2021, we have a record number of countries that have launched probes to explore Mars and have gone to the deepest parts of the seas. We've even created robots that think like us. I feel it's such a shame that again in 2021, we don't have universal access to justice for all. My prayer is that going forward, as we rebuild in a post-pandemic world, we allocate a lot more of our technology resources to be directed towards solving some of these most pressing development challenges, including making access to justice a reality for all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Judge Ibrahim, please.
Thank you very much. Before I go on my reflection, I would like to have a bit of interaction on the questions asked, and particularly this on the how on the prioritization of the access to justice. And actually, when I think of this and what the government has to do, actually, it's that prioritization of access to justice, and the prioritization, like what has been said on the institutional innovations, on the data, on all these innovations and technological aspects. Those should be prioritized to ensure that the government should prioritize on those and should not just make it for in other aspects, like it's something that's not really on the ongoing, or we'll work on it, but now it should be a priority. It should be something that the government or the country cannot go without. I'm saying so because I'm trying to, I'm looking at the circumstances now that we have, that many people at times cannot come to court, because you can find that at times we have to, following this pandemic, we have to adjourn cases for those who don't have any access to, like on these either like the way they have to use the word gadgets, or the computers, on the online transactions, on the virtual, those who can access virtual codes, those who can access Zoom like this, who can access conference calls. They simply cannot come to court because they don't have those facilities. They don't have that access. So that should be the priority to every government, from schools. It can even be done starting with the very local government levels, where they should have even a center that to ensure that some people can go there and manage to have access to courts, instead of coming to courts and being told that with this pandemic, these few days, we can't see people, if you want to access the court, do it online. That was my prioritization on the direction what has been asked. But when we come to the issue or to my reflection vis-a-vis the COVID-19 is concerned, yes, we have all these issues pertaining to the cases being done, or the priorities done on other issues. But like we're saying, justice to climate justice is justice like any other justice. In fact, if we don't have climate justice, we do not have any other justice that will be viable. And poor climate, poor environment will have nothing, and the world would be nothing without sustainable environment. So insofar as when we go to all these measures to ensure that justice is accessed through this COVID-19, then the same should be made a priority on all the accessing justice insofar as environmental law and climate justice is concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I turn to Dr. Gramatikov.
Thank you very much, Director General. I will focus on the question of Mr. Gregory Chak, and I sent him regards. We met 2-3 years ago in Kiev. The question was how important is institutional innovation for anti-corruption, and I think it is incredibly important, and not only for anti-corruption, but also for access to justice and rule of law. Innovation can come from the market. Smart people like Gerald, like Lindros, all these young techies, they can show us great innovations, but it cannot work only in the market. If the institutions do not respond and do not innovate, we don't have an ecosystem. And I know it's difficult, especially in the field of justice, but there are some great examples. If you think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions from Chile, South Africa, East Germany, this was an innovation at the time that solved thousands and thousands of criminal justice cases. Another innovation going on right now, the Supreme Courts of Utah and Arizona in the States are running regulatory sandboxes to see how legal services can be provided despite the regulatory environment and restrictions. Another example is if you look at the Ministry of Justice of the United Arab Emirates, they have a Chief Innovation Officer. So these are just some examples, and I truly believe in the power of innovation of institutions. Many of you remember the 1990s where under the slogan of reinventing government, former Vice President Al Gore created quite a lot of noise in the public sector, which I believe created a lot of good examples. And now is the time probably for all these good examples to come to the field of justice. But basically, I truly believe that institutional innovations, innovation led by public officials, judges, prosecutors, even bar councils, is inevitable and very much needed. Thank you very much. Director General, over to you.
Thank you very much, and really thank you to this whole panel. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm definitely not going to try to sum up everything which has been said, but I think that everyone sees a clear need to address the inequalities, the disparities, and the exclusion which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think all of you in different ways have talked about the people-centered approach at all levels, from local levels to global levels, and about whole of society approaches involving both the public and the private sector, involving the judiciary, the justice sector, involving clearly civil society, and a particular emphasis on youth, and importance not only of involvement of youth, but of youth leadership. I think that has come out very clearly. Innovation, I think another theme, innovation key. wherever you look. And I heard thinking outside the box and really thinking of new ways to do things. And clearly, when we are looking at the response and to building back better or building forward better, I think as is now being said, we have to go, of course, far beyond the health sector. And although universal health coverage is extremely important and also one of those areas we should be working on, but clearly this whole area of technology is huge. Of course, this issue of the digital divide is real, and we've heard a lot about the need for equitable and safe access to new and emerging technologies, and also the gender element there. But also the issue of data. And I think it's really essential that we do have better data so we can have evidence-based decision-making. And it's very clear that we need this data for justice to be a priority. Maybe I'll come back to that word priority at the end. But so we've talked about addressing corruption and illegal financial flows. We've talked about the absolute importance of climate justice, issues around gender equality, issues around effective, inclusive, and accountable institutions and innovations in those institutions. We've talked about expanding jurisprudence, and we've talked about mindset shifts in the legal system, which I think is really important. And of course, the focus on vulnerable groups access to resources, to knowledge, to technology, and very particularly, I think, to rights. And I think through all of this, there's been an emphasis on the importance of multilateralism, global solidarity, and clearly on the primacy of the rule of law in the recovery. And I think we all believe that the rule of law does provide a roadmap with an emphasis on justice for all, on tackling discrimination, raising awareness, and empowering people to know and claim their rights. And so I invite you to look at the roadmap on the IDLO website. And maybe in conclusion, I might give my own personal response to the question as to what can governments and organizations do now, what should be the priorities. Well, firstly, I think one of the priorities has to be vaccine equity, so that we can all have a chance to build back. But I do hope that governments will keep the rule of law and access to justice high on the political agenda and also invest in it. I think we all know that this is one of the areas that is most under-resourced, both at national and at international levels. And so I hope also that governments could prioritize SDG 16, those 3 pillars: justice, peace, and inclusion are extremely important for the recovery. And I think that Gerald said it best: to make universal access to justice for all. So I'd like to thank you all again, the panel. I'd like to thank the President of the Assembly of our Parties, Ambassador Salim, and thank again, of course, our co-sponsors for this event, our Bureau, the governments of Pakistan, Italy, and the United States. Thank you very much. Stay safe and goodbye for now. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.